Hey, here we go, number 4. Today we're going to look at the MattZilla build with the SSD axle housings, and it's all about transmission today. So the first thing we're going to do today is get this transmission off of the Wraith skid plate. This was a pull-off directly out of our Poison Spider Wraith, which we talked about tearing down in video number 1. And then we did the rear axle in video number 2. We converted the rear axle to a centered diamond Wraith rear axle from SSD. And then in the third video, which you can see in the playlist link below in the description box, the front axle got converted from the metal head that was on that truck to a diamond Wraith replacement from SSD, and we used the SSD steering knuckles as well. And today we're going to deal with the transmission and all things power source related. So today we're going to pull this apart. I'm going to add a couple of important upgrades. I'm going to put in a hardened center gear. This is a steel replacement for the plastic gear that's in it. And I'm going to change the gearing to a Robinson Racing 93 tooth spur, which is a big jump from the 80 that was in it. And I'm going to use a 13 tooth pinion gear, which will bring my gear ratio way down. And we're going to keep the factory axial motor for now. Pretty simple to get this switched over. There isn't much here that's going to be a problem. I'm going to pull off the gear cover. I have a suspicion that we won't be able to reuse the gear cover after the huge spur gear goes onto this truck. So you can see the stock gearing right now is 2080. That's the Axial Wraith stock gearing. There's quite a bit of room left on the motor to get the motor swung out of the way, so I'm just going to open this up and push the motor aside and tighten it back up slightly so that we can work on the spur gear end of things. And we're going to have to disassemble basically all of this anyway, because we have to get inside to switch that middle gear. So the first order of business is going to be to remove the spur and the motor, get this freed up, and then we can pull the tranny halves apart and have a look inside. I'm going to get this motor out of here. Remember that the washers on the motor screws are important. So if you can, and you're doing this with a factory axial product, RTR product, they give you the washers on there. There's the brand new motor that's never been used from the Poison Spider Wraith. I'm now going to pull off this nut. Where's my 4-way? Pull off the spur nut. The spur came basically locked on the RTR Poison Spider Wraith. So that gives you an expectation of what kind of abuse this truck was made to take. They intended for you to drive it pretty hard. There's the standard spur gear type. Now when you take this apart, remember that there's a little tiny cross pin in this particular model that drives the spur gear back plate. There's a little cross pin. It's like a hex pin on a wheel, but it's for the tranny shaft. And now we can pull apart these other back of the transmission screws. We will get these taken out, and that will get rid of the front cover, which will split the tranny. There's that. There's a little bit of a spur shaft spacer, don't lose that either. And there's a front screw on here behind the spur plate. We'll get that out of the way. And we should be able to split the gear case now. So, cool thing about these transmissions, all bearings of course, which is great for longevity. Typically the lower gear in the tranny will last quite a bit longer than the top gear in the tranny. I mean the middle, sorry. The middle gear, this one here, is plastic teeth and everything. It has 2 little bearings inside it. You do have to take the bearings out and put them in the metal gear, but I don't know why this seems to be the weak point on the system, but this gear blows out of a factory axial transmission way fast. As soon as you start running it pretty hard, or putting a lot of torque through it, or do a motor change or anything like that, you will find out pretty fast that that center gear will fail. I've seen it happen on brand new rigs, brand new built rigs, custom trucks, you name it. This gear in the center of this transmission right there, this gear is the weak link for sure. And I myself have driven my otherwise stock transmissions with the upgraded steel gear for a really long time before you have a major failure somewhere else. You would be surprised how long this thing will last with just having that extra gear in metal. So now the top gear on the top shaft is metal, it comes that way, and the center gear is now metal. The bottom one is still plastic, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to jam a whole bunch of my favorite white lithium grease in here, and in our experience, this is the single transmission saver. So a nice thick layer on the bottom gear all the way around, one rotation, will allow us to cover all the rest of the gears, because the gear tooth count isn't the same. So if I get the bottom gear gooped up, it will go to the middle gear will transmit it to the top gear, and now I've got a complete tranny greasing, and I only have to grease the bottom gear. It works great. So there we go. I'm going to put this case half back together. All the same components are inside except for that one gear, and this will get our center transmission on the new MattZilla build to a spot where it should be reliable with a moderate amount of horsepower, and we're going to gear it down with the spur and pinion in order to get a whole bunch of fantastic gear reduction, torque. The 20-turn motor that came with the truck will remain on the truck, and it will allow us to have a pretty substantial amount of wheel speed. Even though we've already changed the gearing, the 20-turn motor is pretty fast, so that ought to help. I'm just reassembling this the same way that I took it apart here. It's pretty easy. There's a couple of screws here that go through the plastic housing into the metal motor plate. Make sure when you tighten these up you don't actually over tighten them hardly at all, because what's going to happen is the case will squish, will deform, and as soon as the case deforms it'll create a drag in the transmission. It's just a cheap plastic, thin plastic tranny case. Works great, but don't over tighten the screws. So there we go, that's on. I'm going to reinstall the little tiny pin that drives the spur gear, and then I'm going to put the spur back plate on. Whoops, I forgot the spacer. Don't forget the spacer. This goes on the spur shaft behind the pin, and the reason is because it takes up all of the gear, the bearing lash and whatnot that's left over after the transmission assembly. So when you put this spur plate on, it pushes against that little black spacer, and it takes up the slack in there so that the bearings are in the right spot. The shaft and the gear aren't going to be burning on the case one way or the other. And now we've got that on, we can switch over our spur gear. I'm going to just take this all apart here, and there's washers again on this spur gear bolt setup, and we'll get this pulled off. This is a really small spur, and the 20 tooth pinion with the 80 tooth spur on the factory truck actually provides a significant amount of wheel speed, and a truck's a lot of fun to drive. The problem with it is that the compromise of wheel speed means that when you are doing rock crawling or anything slow, you're really making a lot of motor heat. So we're going to put this new Robinson Racing 93 tooth spur gear on there and line it up so we can reinstall the original hardware. Direct fit, pretty easy. Check out Robinson Racing products at all kinds of RC vendors all over the place. Make sure you give them lots of support. They're producing some of the most reliable quality of gears I think I've ever seen in the RC industry. The consistency from these is great. They're using probably all the same technical programming and sizing for their gears that they've been using all along. There are industry standards for this stuff, and they're obviously doing it because I've been buying these Robinson Racing Delrin spur gears probably for, I would say, 6 or 7 years, and every single one of them is an exact fit for all the other ones. So I don't know, it's so easy. So thank you, Robinson Racing. So I put that on. Now you can see that if I put this inside the cover, you'll see where the problem is. I actually can't get this gear into the cover because it's so big. It doesn't fit in the cover. I think a 91 will fit in the cover with a little bit of a modification on the bottom. This will not. And so we have to leave the cover off now forever, and I couldn't care less about the cover, so that's fine. I'm going to reinstall the slipper spring washers, the slipper nut, and get all this tightened down again. Now, because we're doing a gearing change, the slipper will actually be required to do some more work than it used to be. I'm going to tighten this down so that the spring is actually completely flat, but the spring is not cranked. Okay, so I'm going to turn it until there's no more space in the spring, and then I'm going to stop, and that's it. And by my experience previously, that will give me some slip. So when the wheels are completely bound up, I should be able to squeak the slipper clutch with this gearing. And with this motor on a 2-cell, there should be enough power in there left over to slip the slipper clutch. But not enough to slip it on a climb or anything like that. So I'm going to switch these pinion gears over as well. This is one place where I'm going to put Loctite right away because I don't think there's any point in going over this pinion gear again. I'm going to use my favorite Permatex blue gel, and then get this mounted up here. Don't bother tightening that on yet, because once you get the motor in, you'll discover whether or not you have to slide the pinion in or out or whatever. So just get it on and see where things are at, and you can adjust it after. I'll drop in the 2 motor screws. I'm also going to put a little bit of Loctite on the 2 motor screws, just a tiny bit, so that it doesn't come loose there while I'm bouncing around on the rocks. And don't forget the washer. There we go. Drop in my 2 screws on the motor. Not tight, because you got to set the gear lash. Now there's a lot of discussion about gear lash. How do you set this up properly? There's a million opinions on this. I'm going to show you what I use for my favorite method, and then you guys can decide if it's something that you want to adopt or not. That would be your choice. But I'll show you how I do this, and then maybe you can gain some knowledge out of that and come up with a strategy for yourself that works. If you look at the Axial instructions, they will tell you that you need to put a tiny piece of paper in there and roll the spur gear on the piece of paper so that the paper goes through the 2 gears like this, and then that's supposed to somehow give you the proper spacing on your pinion and your spur. I'll show you what I do. This will give you an idea. We'll get a nice close-up shot here so you can see. I want you to look at the pinion and spur mesh there. See that? I can wiggle this back and forth a tiny bit. You see that? Do you see right there between the pinion and the spur? There's a little tiny gap. You see that? And if I turn this around, the other side, I can check that gap. Tiny, tiny little bit of play. I'm wiggling the spur back and forth. I hope you can see that. And that's how I set these up all the time. No paper or nothing. Just put some of those fancy reading glasses on, or whatever you need to actually see that. And just make sure that your teeth are not tight. Okay? If you have your gear teeth tight, constant contact, then what you're going to end up with in the RC world, maybe that's okay in a super precise, you know, all metal, double bearing, whatever type of industrial application, but if the teeth are in constant contact on an RC, you will melt the teeth off the spur gear. It will produce so much friction, your spur gear will get hot, pinion gear will get hot, and you will melt the teeth off your spur gear. The number one cause of spur gear stripping is probably either too loose, so you're just touching the tips of the teeth and they're not meshing properly, or it's too tight and you're producing friction. So I love that little trick I showed you there with the checking the back play. You can see very clearly that the teeth are well engaged on the spur and the pinion, but they're not in constant contact. As the teeth come around, they make constant contact on one side of the tooth, instead of burying themselves into the V of the tooth. So I would encourage you to try that out. I can tell you that after RCing for 12 years, I have in trucks, I have yet in my entire life to ever strip a spur gear, ever in my entire life. It doesn't matter what the truck was, even if it was the dual brushless, you know, E-Savage builds I've done and everything. I've never in my life stripped a spur gear or had one melt because of tooth mesh. This trick actually works. If you want to use a piece of paper, go for it, but I find that a little too unreliable. I like to actually just see it myself, and that's I can prove that the teeth are fitting in there. I like this method. So the cover will not fit at all. I cannot get the cover back on here, so that's done forever. And my driveline is now ready for install. Boom. That's all we got. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to maintain the stock 20-turn Axial Wraith motor. This motor should last me on a 2-cell for a whole bunch of rock crawling fun. And because the gearing is so low, the motor's going to be barely working at all anymore. Compared to the stock gearing, which was like 3 times taller. With the big tires on this truck, it should be a lot of fun. I think I'll be able to keep the motor heat down to a minimum with this gearing. And now the Robinson Racing center gear is in there, so I think the tranny should be reliable with this much horsepower. It should be good. We are going to take some time to look at the suspension modifications for this setup. And very soon we will come back with a video where we're installing the axles for number 5, and we will install the center transmission and marry it up to the MattZilla cage work. And in number 5 we should have suspension hung, and we will see you soon for the rest of the video build on the MattZilla frame, and enjoy your tiny truck building yourself. See you soon.